What happens when a man who has everything tries to publicly destroy a woman he believes has nothing? In a glittering penthouse overlooking Manhattan, billionaire Arthur Covington decided to make an example of his new maid, a quiet black woman named Serafina. He thought he was teaching her a lesson in front of his powerful friends. He didn't realize he wasn't talking to a maid. He was talking to the one person on earth who held the key to his spectacular ruin. This isn't just a story about a comeback. It's a story about a meticulously planned detonation where the fuse was lit by a single condescending remark. Stay with us as we unfold how one woman's quiet dignity became a weapon that brought a titan to his knees. Serafina Washington had learned that the air in the penthouses of Billionaire's Row was different. It was thin and cold, filtered to an unnatural purity that seemed to scrub away the scent of the real world below. For the past 3 months, this sterile atmosphere had been her world. She was a domestic assistant, a maid in plainer terms in the palatial residence of Arthur Covington, a man whose net worth was discussed in the same reverent tones as the GDP of a small nation. The Covington penthouse, occupying the entire top 2 floors of the monolithic Covington Tower on Park Avenue, was a monument to excess. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of New York City, turning the bustling metropolis into a silent, sparkling tapestry. The walls were adorned not with paintings, but with masterpieces, a Rothko here, a de Kooning there. The furniture was minimalist, brutally expensive, and designed for aesthetics, not comfort. It was a home built to be featured in magazines, not to be lived in. Arthur Covington matched his environment perfectly. He was a man in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair that was always perfectly coiffed, and a jawline that had been surgically sharpened against the ravages of age. His wealth was a mix of old money and new tech. He had inherited a formidable manufacturing empire and had brilliantly pivoted it into Covington Innovations, a tech behemoth that specialized in predictive analytics and quantum computing. He was hailed as a visionary, a titan of industry. In private, he was a petty tyrant. He treated his staff with a chillingly casual disdain. They were fixtures like the Italian marble floors or the Swiss timepieces on his wrist, functional replaceable, and beneath his notice until they failed to perform flawlessly. For Serafina, this meant navigating a minefield of unspoken rules and mercurial moods. A coaster placed a millimeter off-center, a speck of dust caught in a sunbeam, the slightest hesitation in answering a question, all could provoke a quiet, cutting remark that left a deeper wound than any shout. Serafina, however, was an anomaly. In a world of high-strung, perpetually nervous staff, she moved with an unshakable calm. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything, and a posture that radiated a quiet, unyielding dignity. She performed her duties with a meticulousness that was almost unnerving. The other staff members, the chef, the chauffeur, the other housekeepers, watched her with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She was too poised, too self-contained. It was as if she were an actress playing a part, and she had mastered it completely. Her background was by design unremarkable. Her references, sourced through an exclusive domestic staffing agency called Stanton Elite Services, were impeccable. They painted a picture of a career maid with decades of experience serving the upper echelons of society. No one bothered to look deeper. No one questioned why a woman with her command of language and her piercing intellect was polishing silver and turning down bedsheets. Arthur Covington certainly didn't. To him, she was simply the help. He took a strange, almost predatory interest in her composure. He seemed to view her dignity as a challenge. He would leave deliberately difficult messes, change dinner plans at the last minute, to test her adaptability and ask her impossibly vague questions, hoping to see her falter. Serafina, he'd call out, his voice echoing in the cavernous living room. "The Degas. It seems dull today. See to it." He wasn't referring to a print. He was referring to an original pastel sculpture encased in a climate-controlled vitrine. He knew perfectly well that only a museum conservator was permitted to touch it. He just wanted to see the flicker of panic in her eyes. But it never came. "Of course, Mr. Covington," she would reply, her voice even and smooth. "I will schedule its quarterly maintenance with the curator from the Met immediately. Shall I use the standing appointment, or is this an emergency?" Her unflappable competence only seemed to fuel his desire to see her break. He couldn't stand it. He was a man who pulled strings, who made markets tremble and competitors weep, yet he couldn't elicit a single crack in the serene facade of his own Maid. The upcoming Friday was the annual Covington Innovations Gala, a lavish affair held to celebrate the company's continued market dominance. The real party, however, was the exclusive after-party held in his penthouse for a hand-picked selection of about 30 of the most powerful people in the city, rival billionaires, influential politicians, and media moguls. It was Arthur's favorite night of the year, a chance to hold court to be the sun around which all other celestial bodies orbited. And this year, he had decided it would also be the night he finally put Serafina Washington in her place. The thought had been festering in his mind for weeks. He would create a public spectacle, a moment of undeniable humiliation that she couldn't deflect with her quiet efficiency. He wanted to see her stripped of her dignity, to see her squirm under the collective gaze of his guests. He wanted to prove that in his world, she was nothing. He had the perfect plan. It was cruel, it was theatrical, and it was in his mind foolproof. He savored the thought of it, rolling it around in his mind like a vintage brandy. On the Thursday before the party, as Serafina was reviewing the catering manifests and staffing schedules for the evening, Arthur approached her. He was holding a single dust-covered bottle of wine. "Serafina," he said, his voice feigning a tone of magnanimous trust. "This is for tomorrow night. It is a 1947 Chateau Cheval Blanc. It is, to put it in terms you might understand, irreplaceable." He held it out to her. "You and you alone will be responsible for it. You will decant it precisely 1 hour before the guests arrive. Do you understand its importance?" Serafina looked at the bottle, then at his face. Her gaze was steady, unreadable. She saw the glint in his eye, the barely suppressed smirk. She knew this was not an honor, it was a setup. The bottle was a loaded gun, and he was placing it in her hand. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Covington," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. She took the bottle with a steady hand. "It will be handled with the utmost care." As he walked away, a satisfied smile playing on his lips, Serafina looked down at the bottle. He thought he was setting a trap for a maid. He had no idea he was handing the final piece of evidence to the architect of his downfall. The stage was being set, but Arthur Covington had tragically miscast the leading lady. Friday evening descended upon Manhattan, draping the city in a velvet cloak, pricked with 1,000,000 glittering lights. Inside the Covington penthouse, the atmosphere was electric. The main gala downstairs was winding down, and the true power players were beginning to ascend to their private Olympus. Serafina moved through the space with the silent efficiency of a ghost. She had overseen every detail. The floral arrangements were understated, but breathtaking. The catering provided by Jean-Georges von Gerichten's private team was a symphony of culinary perfection. Low atmospheric jazz flowed from hidden speakers, a soothing counterpoint to the city's silent roar outside the vast windows. She had decanted the 1947 Chateau Cheval Blanc exactly as instructed. It now sat on a small, discreet serving table near the center of the main salon, its deep, ruby contents breathing in a crystal decanter. It was a beacon, a focal point of manufactured tension that only she and Arthur understood. The guests began to arrive. There was Marcus Thorne, a rival tech billionaire whose self-made empire in renewable energy made Arthur's inherited fortune feel slightly less legitimate, a fact that galled Arthur to no end. Thorne was sharp, observant, and had a reputation for fairness that stood in stark contrast to Arthur's ruthlessness. There was Eleanor Vance, the city's most feared and respected society columnist. Her weekly column in the New York Ledger could make or break reputations with a single perfectly worded sentence. She missed nothing, and her presence made everyone, including Arthur, stand a little straighter. Senator Morrison, whose campaigns had been generously funded by Covington Innovations, glad-handed his way through the room, his voice booming. A coterie of venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and art dealers filled out the crowd, a veritable ecosystem of wealth and influence. Arthur Covington was in his element. He drifted through the room, a glass of scotch in hand, accepting compliments on his home, his company's latest stock surge, and his impeccable taste. He was the king in his castle, and his subjects were all duly paying homage. Every so often his eyes would flick over to Serafina. He'd see her refilling a guest's glass, or directing a catering staff member with a quiet word, and the cruel anticipation would build within him. He was like a director waiting for the play's most dramatic scene to begin. Serafina, for her part, was a mask of professional serenity. She anticipated needs before they were voiced. She was there with a napkin the moment a drop of condensation threatened a guest's couture, her presence so subtle it was almost subliminal. But beneath this placid surface, her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. She wasn't just a maid observing a party. She was an investigator gathering final reconnaissance. She noted the power dynamics, who deferred to whom, the whispered conversations in corners, the fleeting expressions of envy or contempt. This room wasn't just a collection of wealthy individuals. It was a web of alliances, rivalries, and secrets. It was the ecosystem that had allowed a man like Arthur Covington to thrive, and it was the very thing she was about to shatter. Her focus was laser-sharp. Every move she made was deliberate. When she straightened a cushion on a sofa, her fingers brushed against a tiny listening device she had planted weeks ago. When she collected empty glasses from a side table, her eyes scanned the room, locking in the positions of key individuals. She wasn't just serving, she was positioning the chess pieces for the final move. Around 11 p.m., Arthur decided it was time. The party was at its peak. The conversation was loud, the champagne was flowing, and all eyes were on him as he prepared to give his informal toast. This was the moment of maximum audience, maximum impact. He gestured for Serafina. Serafina the Cheval Blanc. It's time our guests experienced a true piece of history. A hush fell over the room as he spoke. All eyes turned to the small table where the legendary wine sat. This was part of Arthur's theatre to build up the reverence for the object that was about to become the instrument of humiliation. Serafina picked up the crystal decanter. Her hands were perfectly steady. She held a single, long-stemmed glass, ready to pour for her employer. As she walked toward the center of the room where Arthur stood, she could feel the weight of every gaze upon her. It was a long, deliberate walk across an expanse of pristine, cream-colored carpet. It felt like walking a tightrope. She saw the subtle shift in Arthur's stance as she approached. She saw the almost imperceptible tensing of his calf muscle. She knew what was coming. He was going to extend his leg just enough to trip her. It would be deniable, a clumsy accident in a crowded room. But everyone would see the result. The incompetent maid, the the priceless wine staining the priceless rug, the shattered crystal. She was ready. For 3 months she had endured his petty cruelties, his condescending tone, his utter dismissal of her as a human being. She had done it all for this moment. He thought he was about to create a spectacle of her failure. In reality, he was cueing the curtain to rise on his own. As she drew within a few feet of him, their eyes met. His were alight with triumphant malice. Hers were calm, deep, and held a secret fire he couldn't begin to comprehend. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. The first act of Arthur Covington's public downfall was about to begin. The world seemed to slow down. The murmur of the party, the distant jazz, the hum of the city, it all faded into a dull drone in Seraphina's ears. Her focus narrowed to the space between her and Arthur Covington. It was a chasm of just a few feet, but it represented the vast gulf between their perceived stations in life. A gulf he was about to weaponize. Arthur raised his glass of scotch in a pre-toast, drawing every eye. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "In a world of fleeting digital nonsense, it's important to appreciate things that are real. Things with history, with legacy." His words were the perfect cover. As he gestured grandly with his glass, his right foot subtly slid backward, then angled out into Seraphina's path. It was a practiced, almost elegant movement. To anyone not paying close attention, it would look like a simple shifting of weight. To Seraphina, who had anticipated this exact motion, it was as obvious as a theatrical lunge. She had a choice. She could try to sidestep it to avoid the collision, but that would only postpone the inevitable. He would find another way, another moment. No, the plan required the collision. It required his malice to be given form. She let her foot catch his ankle, but she did not fall as he expected. A clumsy, sprawling fall was what he wanted, a spectacle of flailing limbs and shattering glass. Instead, Seraphina executed a controlled stumble. Her body absorbed the impact with a dancer's grace, twisting as she went down. Her primary goal was to protect not the wine, not the decanter, but the small, powerful device hidden in the pocket of her uniform. The decanter tipped. A wave of deep, blood-red liquid, the legendary 1947 Chateau Cheval Blanc, arced through the air. It was almost beautiful, a fleeting ribbon of crimson against the muted tones of the room. It didn't splash onto the cream carpet, as Arthur had perhaps envisioned. Instead, with a final deliberate twist of her wrist that looked like a reflexive spasm, Seraphina directed the spill. The wine crashed directly onto the front of Marcus Thorne's impeccably white tuxedo shirt. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The sound of the heavy crystal decanter hitting the plush carpet with a dull, sickening thud was the only noise that followed. It didn't break, but the final dregs of the wine bled out, creating a dark, accusing stain on the floor. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Marcus Thorne looked down at his shirt, now a mess of scarlet, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. Eleanor Vance's eyes, sharp and analytical, darted from Seraphina on the floor to Arthur's face, already sensing that this was no simple accident. Arthur Covington was momentarily thrown. This was not the scenario he had scripted. Spilling the wine on his rival was so much more complicated, so much messier than just soiling his own rug. But he was a master of improvisation. In fact, this could be even better. He could play the magnanimous host, furious on his guest's behalf. He recovered in a split second. "My God!" He boomed, his voice a perfect blend of shock and fury. He turned on Seraphina, who was slowly, deliberately pushing herself up from the floor. The mask of the charming host dropped, replaced by a sneer of pure contempt. "You clumsy, incompetent fool!" He roared, pointing a trembling finger at her. The volume was shocking in the otherwise quiet room. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Serafina didn't answer. She rose to her full height, brushing off her uniform with a steady hand. Her face was a blank slate, utterly unreadable, which seemed to enrage him further. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Arthur spat, stepping closer to her, invading her space. That was not just wine. That was history. That was a legend in a bottle, and you poured it out like it was cheap table wine. He turned to his guests, spreading his hands in a gesture of shared victimhood. "I am so sorry, Marcus. My sincerest apologies. It seems it is impossible to find decent help these days. Utterly impossible." The insult was twofold, directed at Serafina's competence and tinged with a thinly veiled racism that hung in the air like poison. Marcus Thorne, still dabbing at his shirt with a napkin offered by a horrified catering staffer, held up a hand. "Arthur, it's just a shirt. Let it go. It was an accident." "An accident?" Arthur laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "An accident is spilling a glass of water. This is an act of breathtaking stupidity. This woman—" He gestured at Serafina as if she were a piece of garbage. "Is a liability. I should have known better than to entrust her with anything of value." He had them. The room was his stage, and his guests were his captive audience. He felt the familiar thrill of power of bending a situation to his will. He was going to make an example of her just as he planned. He was going to break her right here, right now. He had ignited the spark of malice, and now he was fanning it into a bonfire of humiliation. Arthur Covington circled Serafina like a shark. He felt the eyes of every person in the room on him, and it fueled his performance. He wasn't just admonishing an employee, he was delivering a sermon on the natural order of things, a world in which men like him presided, and people like her served, and any deviation from that script was an unforgivable sin. "Tell me, Serafina," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. He deliberately used her name, wanting everyone to know who this incompetent person was. "Were you educated? Do you read, or are your hands the only part of you that function, and clearly not very well tonight?" The insult was designed to sting, to reduce her to a mere pair of clumsy hands. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Even for this crowd accustomed to casual cruelty, Arthur's display was becoming crass. But no one dared to intervene. Serafina remained silent, her eyes fixed on his. Her stillness was an act of defiance, and it was driving him to new heights of fury. "I asked you a question," he snapped. "But then again, I can't expect a cogent answer. What could you possibly say? I'm sorry, Mr. Covington." An apology doesn't bring back a 1947 Cheval Blanc. An apology doesn't clean Mr. Thorne's suit. An apology doesn't erase this embarrassment you've caused in my home. He gestured around the room. "These are my friends, my colleagues, the most influential people in this city, and they had to witness this circus act of ineptitude. You haven't just embarrassed yourself, you've embarrassed me." He took another step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial yet carrying whisper. "Let me tell you what that bottle was worth. More than you will make in a decade. More than your entire life is probably worth if we're being honest about it. And you treated it like nothing." This was the core of his attack. It was about value. His guests, his wine, his home, they all had immense value. She had none. That was the message. He turned to Marcus Thorne. "Marcus, again I am mortified. I will of course have a new suit from your tailor delivered to you by morning. As for the damage—" He looked back at Serafina, a cruel smirk forming. "I think it's only fair that you pay for it." A new shocked silence fell over the room. "Yes," Arthur continued, warming to his theme. "I think a lesson in responsibility is in order. We'll deduct the cost of the wine from your salary. At your pay grade, I estimate you should have it paid off in, let's see." He tapped his chin in mock calculation. 70, maybe 80 years. Of course you're fired, so that complicates things. We'll have to put a lien on any future earnings. It was a grotesque, theatrical display of power. He wasn't just firing her. He was attempting to sentence her to a lifetime of debt over a bottle of wine he had caused her to spill. He was trying to shackle her to this moment of humiliation forever. He looked at her, expecting to finally see the tears, the pleading, the breakdown he so desperately craved. "Well," he demanded, "what do you have to say for yourself? Apologize. Apologize to me and apologize to Mr. Thorne. Now." This was the climax of his play, the demand for a forced public apology, the ultimate act of submission. Serafina took a slow, deliberate breath. The air in the room was thick with tension. Every eye was on her. Eleanor Vance had discreetly taken out her phone, her thumb hovering over the record button. Marcus Thorne looked on with a grim expression, his initial embarrassment replaced by a growing disgust at Arthur's behavior. For the first time since the incident began, Serafina's expression changed. The blank mask of professionalism dissolved, but it wasn't replaced by fear or shame. A flicker of something else appeared in her eyes, something cold, hard, and brilliant like a diamond. She raised her head, her posture regal, and her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the silent, watching guests. Then her eyes settled back on Arthur. Covington, the man who thought he had cornered and broken her. And she spoke. Her voice was not the demure, quiet tone of a maid. It was clear, crisp, and resonant, cutting through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "There will be no apology," she said. The word, simple and direct, landed like a physical blow. The defiance was so absolute, so unexpected, that Arthur actually took a step back. "What did you just say?" he stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "I said," Serafina repeated, her voice rising slightly in volume, each syllable perfectly enunciated, "there will be no apology, because an apology would imply an accident has occurred, and nothing that has happened here tonight, Mr. Covington, has been an accident." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This was not the response anyone expected. This was something new, something dangerous. Serafina continued, her eyes locked on Arthur's. "And secondly, I must correct you on a minor but telling point of fact. The wine, while excellent, was not a 1947 Cheval Blanc." The statement was so bizarre, so out of left field, that it momentarily stunned the entire room into silence. Arthur just stared at her, his mouth agape. "What? What nonsense are you talking about now?" "It's a common mistake for an amateur," Serafina said, a hint of pity in her voice. "The 47 is legendary, of course, but a true connoisseur would have noticed the slight imbalance in the tannins and the premature oxidization on the nose. This was a 1949. A fine vintage, to be sure, but a lesser one. Worth at auction perhaps a fifth of what you claimed. You've been had, Mr. Covington. Or perhaps you were simply lying to inflate your own importance." The humiliation Arthur had so carefully constructed for her had just boomeranged. In a few sentences, she had questioned his knowledge, his wealth, and his integrity. She had taken control of the narrative. The unmasking had begun. A bomb had gone off in the penthouse, but it was a silent one. The shrapnel was confusion shock and a dawning delicious sense of scandal. Eleanor Vance was no longer even pretending to be discreet. Her phone was openly recording, her journalist's eyes gleaming. Marcus Thorne, forgetting his stained shirt, watched Serafina with a newfound, intense interest. Arthur Covington was reeling. He, the great Arthur Covington, being corrected on enology by his maid in front of everyone, it was absurd. It was impossible. How dare you? He sputtered, his face a mask of incandescent rage. You are a maid. What would you know about? I know a great many things, Arthur. Serafina cut in. The use of his first name was a deliberate, shocking violation of protocol. It was a declaration that the roles of master and servant were now null and void. For example, I know that your claim to have personally acquired the bottle at a Sotheby's auction in 2012 is false. That particular lot was sold to a Mr. Alistair Finch of London. You purchased this bottle from a secondary dealer known for trafficking in counterfeit and mislabeled vintages. She spoke with the calm, irrefutable authority of an expert witness. The specific details, the name, the auction house, the year, gave her words a terrifying weight of truth. Arthur was speechless. He didn't know if she was right, but she sounded right, and in this room, perception was reality. He could feel the tide of opinion turning against him. The guests were no longer watching a maid get her comeuppance. They were watching a billionaire be dissected. "Who are you?" He finally managed to whisper the question hanging in the air. Serafina smiled, but it was a cold, sharp thing. "That is a much better question. The answer you have on my employment file says that I am Serafina Washington, a career domestic worker. That is a fiction." She reached into the pocket of her simple black uniform and pulled out a slim metallic object. It was a USB flash drive. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger. "My real name," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "is Dr. Serafina Washington. My PhD is in quantum computing from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. For 6 years, I was the lead architect of a proprietary research initiative at a small but brilliant R&D firm called Etheria Labs. We called our project Chimera. At the mention of the name Chimera, a visible jolt went through Arthur Covington. His face went from red to a ghastly, waxy white. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost. Marcus Thorne from across the room stiffened. He knew that name. Everyone in the high-tech world knew of Project Chimera. It was the revolutionary quantum AI algorithm that Covington Innovations had unveiled the previous year, the very technology that had sent their stock price into the stratosphere, and made Arthur not just a billionaire, but a kingmaker. It was considered his magnum opus. Project Chimera. Dr. Washington continued, her voice like ice, was set to redefine data encryption, predictive modeling, everything. It was my life's work. The work of my team. A team that was dismantled, whose funding was mysteriously pulled, and whose research, every last byte, vanished from our servers one weekend 2 years ago. She took a step toward Arthur, who instinctively took a step back. 3 months later, Covington Innovations announced a breakthrough of their own. They called it Project Prometheus. But it was just Chimera rebranded and stolen. You didn't innovate, Arthur. You were a common thief in a billion-dollar suit. You stole our work, you buried our company, and you destroyed the careers of 22 brilliant researchers. The room was so quiet you could hear the clink of ice melting in abandoned glasses. The story she was telling was not just one of corporate malfeasance. It was the story of a heist of epic proportions, a theft of intellectual property that was the modern equivalent of stealing the crown jewels. You thought you were untouchable, Dr. Washington said, her gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of the guests. You thought you had covered your tracks, but you got greedy. The lead engineer you bribed from my team, a man named David Chen, got sloppy. He left a digital breadcrumb trail. A very faint one, but it was there. And for the last 18 months, I have been following that trail." She gestured around the opulent penthouse. "The trail led me here, to the heart of your empire. I needed incontrovertible proof, something that would stand up in federal court, something that couldn't be buried by your army of lawyers. I needed proof from inside your own network, from inside your own home." She looked at the flash drive she was holding. "I knew your arrogance was your weakness. You believe your staff to be invisible. You never imagined one of them could be literate. So I became invisible. I got impeccable forged references. I became the perfect, quiet maid. And for 3 months, I have had access to everything. Your personal computers, your home office, the servers you thought were so secure. You are a man of routine, Arthur. Every Tuesday you play squash. It gave me the perfect 90-minute window each week." She turned her head slightly to address the stunned guests. What he stole wasn't just a product. It was a quantum key encryption system. The irony is he used a standard commercial-grade security system to protect the stolen data on his own network. For someone with my skills, it was like opening a child's diary. She looked back at Arthur. Her unmasking was complete. She was not a maid. She was a ghost from his past, an avenging angel of intellectual property law, and she had just revealed herself in the most public and damaging way imaginable. The humiliation he had planned for her was a child's prank compared to the utter annihilation she was now visiting upon him. The term fall from grace was inadequate for what was happening to Arthur Covington. It was more like being pushed from the top of his own tower. Dr. Serafina Washington stood before him, not as an accuser, but as a judge who had already delivered the verdict. The penthouse was her courtroom, and his peers were the jury. "On this drive," she said, holding the small piece of metal aloft as if it were a scepter, "is everything. The original source code for Chimera, with my team's unique digital signatures and time-stamped development logs which predate your fraudulent patent filings by over a year." She paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. Patent fraud was a federal crime. "It also contains copies of your internal emails, specifically the ones between you and your former Chief Technology Officer, Michael Corrigan, where you explicitly discuss the acquisition of Etheria Labs research and the strategy to reverse engineer the public-facing elements to disguise its origin." Arthur's jaw worked silently. Michael Corrigan had been fired 6 months ago in a dispute over stock options. He was a disgruntled, dangerous loose end. "And finally," Dr. Washington said, delivering the killing blow, "it contains a sworn videotaped deposition from David Chen, my former engineer, who you bribed. He contacted me 2 months ago, consumed by guilt, and terrified you were about to make him the fall guy. He has provided federal investigators with the exact details of the data transfer, including the offshore accounts you used to pay him. He kept meticulous records, Arthur. He was always smarter than you gave him credit for." If a man could physically shrink, Arthur Covington did. In the space of 5 minutes, he had gone from a titan of industry to a common criminal exposed in front of his entire world. The power, the arrogance, the aura of invincibility, it all evaporated, leaving behind a pale, trembling man in an expensive suit. Dr. Washington then turned her attention to Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice now calm and professional, "I must apologize to you. I had to create a distraction, a moment of chaos that would focus every eye in this room. Your shirt was an unfortunate but necessary casualty. I assure you the spill was completely under my control." Marcus Thorne looked from his ruined shirt to her face, and a slow smile spread across his lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. "Dr. Washington," he said, his voice full of admiration. "Do not give it a second thought. This is the best show I've seen in New York in 20 years. In fact," he unbuttoned his jacket, "consider this shirt a contribution to the cause." He then looked at Arthur with utter contempt. "Covington, I've always known you were a snake. I just never realized you were a rat as well." That single sentence from his chief rival sealed Arthur's social and professional execution. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were backing away from Arthur as if he were contagious. Phones were out everywhere, no longer recording but texting, emailing, calling brokers. The news was already hitting the insular world of high finance. By the time the markets opened in Asia, Covington Innovations stock would be in freefall. Eleanor Vance walked calmly over to Dr. Washington, her expression one of professional awe. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I'm Eleanor Vance of the Ledger. You have my word that I will report this story with the accuracy and the prominence it deserves. The full story. Your story." Dr. Washington nodded. "Thank you, Miss Vance. That's all I ask." She then turned for the last time to face the man whose life she had just systematically dismantled. Arthur Covington stood alone in the middle of his ridiculously large living room, a pariah in his own home. His face was a canvas of disbelief, fury, and raw primal fear. "You see, Arthur," Dr. Washington said, her voice soft now, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "You wanted to teach me a lesson about my value. You wanted to humiliate me over a stain on your carpet. But you were wrong about everything. You were wrong about the wine, you were wrong about me, and you were wrong about the stain." She glanced down at the dark red blotch on the cream-colored carpet. "That isn't the real stain in this room. The real stain is your legacy. The real stain is a spectacular career built on theft lies and the destruction of other people's dreams. Unlike this carpet, that's a stain that will never, ever come out." With that, she turned her back on him. She walked not with the hurried gait of a fired maid, but with the measured, confident stride of a victorious general leaving the field of battle. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sounds from the room told her everything she needed to know. The frantic, hushed phone calls, the scraping of chairs as people made hasty exits, and the deafening, soul-crushing silence emanating from the spot where Arthur Covington stood, his billion-dollar empire crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. The annihilation was total. Dr. Serafina Washington did not exit through the service elevator. She walked with the unhurried pace of someone whose work is finally done to the grand marble entrance of the penthouse. The uniformed doorman, a man named George, whom she had always greeted with a polite nod, stared as if he were seeing her for the first time. He fumbled to open the door for her, his professional composure shattered. She gave him a small, genuine smile. "Have a good night, George." She stepped into the private elevator, its polished bronze walls reflecting a woman she hadn't seen in a long time. Not a maid, not an operative, but herself. As the doors slid shut, sealing her off from the wreckage she had wrought, she did not feel a rush of elation or a thirst for revenge. Instead, a profound, bone-deep sense of peace settled over her. It was the quiet that comes after a long storm. For the first time in 2 years, the weight of her stolen past and the burden of her secret mission lifted. She leaned her head back against the cool metal and closed her eyes for the entire 90-floor descent, a journey from a gilded cage back down to the real world. Behind her, the party had imploded. The atmosphere of celebratory schmoozing had curdled into one of frantic self-preservation. Whispers turned to panicked murmurs. "Did you hear that patent fraud? My fund has a 9-figure position in Covington Innovations. Get me out of here. I was never here." Alliances that had been forged over cocktails just an hour earlier dissolved in an instant. They were no longer guests at a party. They were witnesses at a crime scene, and their only instinct was to flee before they were contaminated by association. Marcus Thorne was the last guest to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at Arthur, who stood like a statue in the center of the room, his face the color of ash. "You know, Arthur," Thorne said, his voice devoid of any pity, "I'm going to buy your company. I'll pick it up for pennies on the dollar after the stock craters on Monday. And the first thing I'm going to do is rename it Etheria, just so you never ever forget." Then he too was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving Arthur Covington alone in the cavernous silence of his life's monument. The only remaining occupants were the catering staff, who now moved with terrified quiet, collecting abandoned glasses and plates of untouched food. They didn't look at him, but he could feel their stares, their judgment. These were the invisible people he had lauded his power over for years, and now they were the only ones left to witness his utter desolation. His eyes fell to the dark red stain on the priceless carpet. It looked like a gaping wound. The room, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a mausoleum. The city lights outside, once a glittering kingdom at his feet, now seemed to mock him, indifferent to his spectacular fall. His phone began to ring the name of his lead board member, flashing on the screen. He couldn't bring himself to answer it. Meanwhile, in a taxi speeding through the sleeping city, Eleanor Vance was typing furiously on her laptop, the glow illuminating her intense expression. This wasn't just a column. It was the story of a decade. She ignored the grammar, the spelling just getting the raw, explosive truth down. The quiet maid, the stolen tech, the public takedown. It was a story of hubris and nemesis, so perfect it felt like something out of a Greek tragedy. She crafted the headline, deleting and rewriting, until it was perfect: The Fall of the House of Covington, how a billionaire's stolen empire was exposed by the woman he tried to shame. She hit publish at 3:17 a.m. The internet and Arthur's world would never be the same. The story detonated across the digital world as the sun rose on Saturday. It was too cinematic, too compelling to be ignored. By 9 a.m., it had been picked up by every major news outlet on the planet. Financial networks like Bloomberg and CNBC ran frantic segments not on Covington Innovation's stock price, but on its very existence. Tech journalists resurrected the ghost of Etheria Labs, now confirmed to be the true source of the Covington miracle. On social media, Dr. Serafina Washington became an overnight folk hero. The Maid and the Mogul and Project Chimera trended globally. People shared the story with captions like, "This is what happens when you underestimate a woman, and get you a queen who can serve you justice." For Arthur, the fallout was a relentless rolling avalanche. The emergency board meeting happened via a Zoom call from which he was pointedly excluded. His resignation was accepted before he had even formally offered it. On Monday morning, he watched on television as Covington Innovation's stock, finally resuming trading, lost 92% of its value in the first 7 minutes before the circuit breakers kicked in and halted it again. The company he had built into a titan, the source of his identity and power, had been reduced to a penny stock, a corporate ghost. That afternoon, 2 stone-faced agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division arrived at his penthouse. They were polite, professional, and utterly unmoved by his name. They presented him with a warrant, and for the next several hours he was forced to sit in silence as they methodically boxed up his computers, his files, his entire life's work. The final humiliation came when they asked him to accompany them. As he was escorted out of the building, he owned past the stunned faces of the staff and residents. He wasn't just losing his freedom, he was being erased. Dr. Washington, in contrast, was just beginning to build. The day after the party, she received a call from a senior partner at one of the top law firms in the country, offering full pro bono representation. The partner mentioned that a mutual acquaintance, Mr. Thorne, had suggested he call. Serafina accepted. Her first request was not for a civil suit against Arthur, but for them to track down every member of the original Etheria Labs team. A week later, 22 people gathered in a simple conference room at the law firm's office. They were software engineers, data scientists, and researchers who had scattered to the winds after Etheria collapsed. They had taken jobs at universities at rival companies, or had left the field altogether disillusioned and heartbroken. They greeted each other with cautious hugs and confused expressions, unsure why they had been summoned. Then Dr. Serafina Washington walked in. A ripple of shock and emotion went through the room. They saw their leader, the woman they had admired who had vanished after the collapse. Before she could even speak, a young engineer named Priya stood up, tears in her eyes. "Sarah, we thought you gave up." Serafina's composed exterior finally cracked. A tear traced a path down her own cheek. "I never gave up," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just went undercover, and I'm here to tell you, we got it back. We got it all back. Project Chimera is ours again." The room erupted. The years of frustration of feeling cheated and erased poured out in a cathartic wave of cheers and applause. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, more satisfying than any stock price or magazine cover. It was a restoration of legacy. In the years that followed, the two legacies diverged completely. Arthur Covington, after a protracted and ruinously expensive legal battle, pleaded guilty to patent fraud and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. He was sentenced to 8 years in a federal minimum security prison. He lost his fortune, his company, and his name. When he was released, he was a stooped, grey figure, a ghost of Billionaire's Row, occasionally spotted, walking alone in Central Park, utterly forgotten by the world he once ruled. Etheria Labs, on the other hand, rose from the ashes. With a massive infusion of capital from Marcus Thorne, and under the leadership of CEO Dr. Serafina Washington, they launched Chimera. It was a staggering success, revolutionizing fields from medicine to climate science. But Dr. Washington's mission had expanded. She became a towering figure in the tech world, not just for her brilliance, but for her unwavering ethical compass. She testified before Congress about intellectual property rights. She established a foundation to fund and mentor women and minorities in STEM. She often gave the keynote address to the graduating class at her alma mater, MIT. Standing before a new generation of innovators, she would end her speech with the story of a very expensive bottle of wine. The man who tried to shame me believed the world was divided into valuable objects and disposable people, she would tell the rapt audience. That was his fatal flaw. He couldn't see that a person's worth isn't determined by their uniform or their bank balance. It's forged in their intellect, their integrity, and their resilience. He tried to define me by the lowest point in my strategy, not realizing it was a stepping stone to my highest victory. Remember this: never let anyone else define your value. And know that the most powerful force in the universe is not money or influence. It is the truth wielded by a mind that has been underestimated. In the end, the story was not about a billionaire and a maid. It was about a thief who built a castle of sand and a brilliant architect who waited patiently for the tide to turn. Arthur Covington had tried to create a stain, and he had succeeded. It just wasn't on the carpet. It was on the pages of history, forever marking to the spot where arrogance fell and integrity rose. The story of Dr. Serafina Washington and Arthur Covington is a powerful reminder that the most formidable weapon against arrogance is intelligence, and the greatest answer to cruelty is unshakable integrity. In a world where wealth and power often seem to silence truth, she proved that one person armed with purpose and the courage to act can dismantle an empire of lies. Her victory wasn't just for herself or her team. It was for every person who has ever been underestimated, dismissed or wronged by those who believe they are above accountability. It's a testament to the fact that justice, though sometimes slow and silent, can be meticulously, beautifully, and completely served. If you are moved by this story of justice and believe that true strength lies not in shouting, but in quiet, brilliant execution, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with others who need to hear that the underdog can win. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true life stories where character triumphs over corruption and the deserving get the last word. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of justice being served.